Hello, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of Outseer, welcome to our discussion on preparing for the Nacha ACH rule changes and false pretenses compliance. I'm Peter Tapling. Joining me today for this discussion are Jordan Bennett from Nacha and Wade Raef from Outseer. So, Jordan, Wade, can you please give a quick introduction of yourself? Wade, Jordan first.
Sure. Hey, my name is Jordan Bennett. I am with Nacha. I'm a senior director of ACH Network Risk Management, and I get to work with risk management on the ACH network, trying to see what's happening out there and find solutions to protect consumers, businesses, everybody on the ACH network. I work with the Risk Management Advisory Group, and we helped develop some of the rules that we'll be talking about today.
Excellent. Thank you, Wade.
I'm Wade Raef, senior solution consultant with Outseer. I get to work with banks and partner with them on how to solve these kind of problems and really how to look at fraud as a whole. So happy to be here and look at it from a perspective where we can get into the nitty gritty of what to actually do.
Yes, and kind of speaking of nitty gritty, you have some great resources here on the panel, of course, in Wade and Jordan. But we are welcoming questions. There's a Q&A button on the right-hand side of your screen, so please enter your questions there. We'll try and get to them as we go along. Jordan, to kind of kick this off, could you, representing Nacha, could you kind of go over the rule changes? What are we actually talking about here?
Well, let me give you a little history of it first. So we started out with a new risk management framework around 2022, and we had to change because fraud is changing. And we, do our best to be proactive, but you have to sometimes react to fraud, and we're trying to get out ahead of some new schemes that we're seeing or we're seeing really taking over. The difference between kind of what was happening, which was, your long history of debit fraud. Now, with debit fraud, that is never going away. The network has done a really, really good job. When I started in the mid 2000s, we were looking at almost 1% of items were coming back as unauthorized. We had a real problem on our hands. New rules were put in place, and now the network, I think this year, was 0.05%. So a significant reduction in debit fraud. So the fraudsters moved to different schemes, and these schemes are old, but now they're becoming more prevalent because fraudsters are moving to what works. So they're doing things like business email compromise, vendor impersonation, payroll impersonation. All of these schemes are a little bit different because they're requiring the originator to push out, convincing the originator to push that credit out. And the receiver is hanging out at the RDFI as opposed to stealing your routing and account number and then just debiting you as an originator. So it kind of flips where the parties are involved. The victim is on the origination side in many cases, and the receiver is hiding at that RDFI. And so we put a number of rules together, and this was a rules package that was voted on by the network. I did look at the list of attendees today. Many of your financial institutions voted on this rules package, and everybody on the network can be involved when we make rules. So there's always a request for information or a request for comment that goes out around rules, and we take the whole network's opinion and try to build that when we're building rules. So we had this package that went together. We have the fraud monitoring rules, which the rules are going out on originators, third-party senders, and ODFIs to monitor outgoing fraud. We have the RDFI side, where RDFIs are now going to be asked to monitor for incoming credits, looking for fraud there. We changed the exemption from funds availability to give you a little bit more time to see to review any red flags that you have. And we gave you an expanded use of R17. That return code, you can now return an item if you believe a item came in as fraudulent. You can just kick it right back to that originator and say, hey, we think this it looks like fraud. It doesn't look right. We're going to send it back. And that one actually has already been in place along with that exemption from funds availability. We also had an extension on ODFI request for return. Now you can, as an ODFI, if your customer calls you and says, hey, oh, I really shouldn't have sent this out, but I sent it out as an ODFI, and you can go out to that RDFI and send a request for return uh, for any reason. We did have limitations on that before. Those are now gone. And all of those took effect in 2024. So it's the fraud monitoring and the credit monitoring that are coming up next month. So, or in March, we're almost February. Coming up in March for the largest institutions and June for the rest of the banks and third-party senders and originators. We also have the standardized descriptions, and that is for payroll and for online purchases. If we are asking the RDFIs to do something and to monitor, it is much easier to do monitoring if everything comes in consistently and the same. So with that payroll, PAYROLL, you have to put that in the company entry description for all payroll type transactions, and that will let the RDFI see if there's payroll impersonation fraud. If, for example, you have an individual getting a direct deposit for Jordan Bennett, Peter Tapling, and Wade Raef, right? And that's a red flag that the banks can see, and that standardized description will help you see that so it doesn't come in 3 different ways for all of us. We do have some resources out there and available online. If you go to nacha.org, we have a couple of resource pages. This first one here is the rules page, and the next one is the credit push fraud resources page. You can click there and see all of the available vendors and get some good ideas of things that you can do to implement these new credit push fraud monitoring rules. All right, so
Excellent.
that's just
Thank
a super quick intro to the rules.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say we're going to get to chat a little bit more about all of this. So Wade, for your customers, what was the very first reaction when this came out? Did they even pay attention to it? Mute.
Thanks. I saw when we saw it as a whole. I think both my customer and myself, it looked less like an ACH problem and more like a not just enforcing some consistency around how fraud and risk is actually mitigated. So most banks already have a bunch of these pieces in place, and we just began looking at what those pieces are, how to tie them in together, and create a defensible story right for those regulators that would be
Yeah.
just looking downstream.
Yeah, well, and here we are, 35, 45 days out from the rule taking effect. What should, and by the way, the difference between the largest financial institutions needing to be live and everyone else is a very short time frame. I mean, some of the times the Nacha rules give a full year before the smallest financial institutions have to join. But by now, what should financial institutions have been thinking about and been doing and been programmatically changing what they've been up to? As you mentioned, many of the tools already exist.
Yeah, absolutely. No one should be shopping for tools at this point. We should be organizing what we already have. So the real work is in identifying that risk and how documenting that, how decisions are made, how the fraud signals turn into action, and needing to be able to explain that clearly, right? How that rule will expose it.
And
Yeah.
I think something you said there, Wade, is super important. The fact that many financial institutions have the tools already, and you've been doing many of these things for a long time. So when we were thinking about how to build the rules, we did try to make it match some of the BSA and AML things that banks are already doing, but necessarily aren't communicating amongst different departments.
Yeah. And so, what steps should they take? How should they, like, it's not only today, because these are programs that are going to be living programs as things change. So, I think you have a slide on it.
Yeah, it's really simple, right? In theory here, and in practice, I think it's just as simple because it's folding into a bunch of existing frameworks teams have, right? Whether that's the AML groups or fraud specific, a general fraud group looking at fraud, right? We need first, like I said, you need to document and write down what you actually have for managing ACH risk, and then take a snapshot of what that risk looks like today. Um, Make sure you're looking at the right signals that work for your FI because you do need to understand where those risks actually lie, and then put in those controls for what those next steps will look like. And I think another piece I didn't put on here was there is a component of the annual audit where you need to be looking at how you've performed. And I don't think that's an annual process, right? That's like a bare minimum requirement. This should be a continuous improvement process where we're monitoring for false pretenses, but again, part of a broader ecosystem of looking at fraud.
And we did
Yeah.
write that into the rule, right? So you have to review at least yearly. So that is a minimum standard. Monitoring, documenting changes as they go, I think is very important. And anytime you have a change to any of your offerings, any of your tools, don't wait if 9 months because of a rolling timeline that's coming up. Document that when you get that new program.
Yeah, and I think you guys both bring up a really good point that this is going to be a living, breathing set of policies and procedures. And I know when we had our warm up exercise, Jordan, we talked about this concept of minimum compliance, like do the minimum to come up with a compliance, and you almost jumped through the camera. So I know you have strong thoughts on this.
I do have strong thoughts on this. This is not an exercise in trying to check boxes. It's not an exercise in just being compliant. We're really trying to keep the fraud off the ACH network. And as financial institutions, and I saw there's another number of other organizations on here, you're trying to keep your customers and yourselves from being defrauded. We don't want to, if you're an RDFI, you do not want to be the bank that you either are housing knowingly the fraudster or you missed the review when you did onboarding, right? So being the bank that has a fraudster as a customer is not a situation any of us want to be in. So having, the rules, have a fairly, the bar's not super high. It says you must do something, right? You have to put in components or policies and procedures that are designed to identify credit push fraud. And, that's the minimum, but you really do want to try and catch these guys and get them off the system. Anytime that they are able to successfully commit fraud, they're going to reinvest, use those resources, and you're going to be the next victim. So it's super important that we're working together as an industry to solve this problem.
Yeah,
I
I'm
want to
going
echo
to.
something there.
Oh, go ahead, Wade. Go ahead, Wade.
Minimum compliance usually means we're reacting after something breaks. We see this all the time with customers, right? So I
Absolutely.
know what I can see is Nacha's really pushing here for intentionality, knowing why you're comfortable with certain risks, and just being able to explain those decisions later is really going to be important.
I liked how
Yeah,
you
and I'm
said
going to shift to
that
one of the
document earlier.
questions. I'm going to shift to one of the questions, and I think Jordan, you're heading down this path. One of the questions was, is there a solid summary of compliance recommendations per the requirements in the rule? And Nacha, in a lot of the rules, tends to lean on that commercially reasonable phrase. They did not use commercially reasonable in this rule. But where would you steer people for guidance on? Look, this is it's always easier in an organization to pay for something when I'm told I have to do it, when it's a regulatory spend. So where would you send people for a list of these are the things you need to be looking for?
So that's a huge challenge, Peter. And the rule was intentionally written somewhat vaguely, right? And I noticed on the list of attendees, we have J.P. Morgan Chase, we have Truist, we have U.S. Bank, and we also have some what look like very small community banks trying to write a rule where some of the largest banks in the nation have to do the exact same thing as a local bank that knows their customers is extremely difficult. Whereas, there's no way that the largest banks are going to be able to manually look at a file and say, this doesn't look right. Where if you have a small bank, they can write policies and procedures, and they may have a small staff that can look at a file and spot an abnormality, right? So you're going to have to document to your auditors. You're going to have to document to your own folks proof that what you're doing is saying what you're doing, right? That you're doing something. You've got either a tool, if you build it, buy it, whatever, you've got a tool that you're using and you're following through. right? Just because you purchase a tool, that's not necessarily good enough. You've got to follow those red flags. You've got to do the research. You've got to show that you are, following all of your processes and procedures, and trying to identify that fraud, or identify that it is a, it was a red flag, but it's okay, and letting that one go.
Yeah. Wade, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of the bread and butter of what we do on a day-to-day basis with our customers. We those kind of tools can take a variety of forms. Just thinking about how we operate, for example, in highlighting some of these. I know we're going to talk about false pretenses as well, right? How do I get that fraud typology down? We allow our users to tag in case manager, and then those policies that they write have nomenclature attached to them, and whenever there's a change that happens, that always goes through a customer's change approval board or change control board, and those processes are usually documented as well. So, to the point earlier that there's documentation and there's things that are already being done, a lot of this framework really exists. So it's about tailoring it and making sure, to Jordan's point, that we're intentionally documenting it, intentionally updating it, right? Really about that intentionality.
Yeah. Have a program, say what you're going to do, and then do what you're going to say, or do what
Correct.
you say you're going to do. So you mentioned false pretenses. Let's go ahead and dive into that a little bit. There's a question that came in earlier about what is the definition for false pretenses. And Jordan, I know that in the rule they actually give a 1 or 2 sentence
Yeah, it's a defined
definition.
term. It's a new defined term. We don't always define terms, but sometimes we do, and this is one of them. So I'm going to read it here for you. It is the inducement of a payment by a person misrepresenting A, that person's identity, B, that person's association with or authority to act on behalf of another person, or the ownership of an account to be credited. So that's it. That's false
Yeah,
pretenses
and
right there.
that
And it's been working
definition
with.
really leans into the problems you were highlighting, things like business email compromise. But it also highlights some real challenges in that how do I know? How do I evaluate? Is this is the party trying to initiate the payment doing so based on an instruction of someone who has good intent?
And that's a challenge. And there are different ways to do that. I was speaking earlier this week with a company who um, they have a software that they can tell when by the how long it takes for people to keylog and to type something in, whether they're being induced, and it will then reach out to the bank and say, hey, we think this is happening. Reach out to your customer, and they can have different prompts on their banking software. I thought that was pretty cool. You can also, on the RDFI side, you can look and see, is this a brand new account that's um, all of a sudden receiving very large CCD transactions when it is a personal account? Or is this a long dormant account that's now receiving a lot of funds? Is it uh, an individual who's receiving lots of different payroll transactions, where typically they haven't in the past? So finding those variances and looking for what should be typical, what is normal, and what outliers are is a different way to find that
Yeah,
software.
and yeah, and Wade, this is we've been talking about these kinds of things on other payment channels for years, and so it's kind of bringing the ACH network under the tent of this, looking for patterns of ill-gotten activity. So talk a little bit about in the real world, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in terms of programs that are bringing the ACH under this tent?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I see with a lot of my customers, and I'm kind of thinking of one in particular, is they're making this bridge between, again, not just ACH, but what does the rest of their ecosystem look like? How are users moving funds through in and out? Is the origination, or sorry, is the recipient getting that money from an ACH, but then sending it out through something like a different network, like Zelle, or another real time payment network? So trying to figure out where that piece ties everything together is a big critical component, right? I get Nacha's intent here is to make ACH the stronger of the solutions so that we can stop fraud here and it's not being perpetrated on the network, which I really appreciate. I had actually had a question on the false pretenses too, Jordan, because we've been talking a little bit about what that means, and I get the breach of trust, but who is it that I'm trusting necessarily? business email compromise is a pretty easy example, but if I'm on Facebook Marketplace, is that a breach of trust?
Sure. I mean, we're talking about puppy scams, right? That was a big
Exactly.
one during the pandemic that, we'll take your deposit. Uh, Personally, I have a rental property and I listed it on Zelle one time and, or not Zelle, Zillow. And somebody created a Facebook Marketplace ad using all of my pictures, right? And that would be false pretenses because that person doesn't own my house, right? When they're trying to list it. And that is false pretenses. If you give them the deposit and first month's rent and they run off, and then you come to me trying to rent the house and I have no, I'm not aware of the situation at all, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question in here that I'm gonna morph it a little bit to ask a question. So
Okay.
they talk about a tool that they use and how that tool has a time frame for reacting to signals. And in the ACH network, pre same day ACH, we built a bunch of programs. They were batch based. They triggered every day, and so the question here is, what practices, what can I really do with an ACH transaction where I'm still only triggering it in batch, that feels more real time in terms of trying to identify this stuff?
Yeah, was that a question to me or to
Yes,
Jordan
Wade.
first?
Yes,
Yeah,
Wade.
okay.
You're the tool guy, man.
Yeah.
You got
No, absolutely. So there's I do have customers doing this in batch where we're doing some pre-processing. We run those through risk analysis first. So that's definitely something that can be done before it gets sent out to the network. So we're the layer that sits between, that decisioning layer that sits between what actually happened, sending it to the actual ACH network and processing that payment. So that would be probably the easiest thing I could think of off the top of my head is introduce something. Again, you already have a tool that does this. It's about funneling that process in the middle of that junction point.
Yeah,
So
and Jordan, on the receiving side, the RDFI side, by definition, you're receiving these things in batch. There's nothing you can do until you see the transaction, right?
That's
Uh, and then what tool do you have in your drawer at that moment, right? Just the R17, or are there others?
so you do have the R17 if you notice as it's coming in. The rule does not state that you have to review every transaction before you post. You can look at, build a history. We hope that you catch every single one, but that is not the standard that you're being held to, right? So you can still post on routing and account number. You do need to put something in place, and it could be after the fact. Clearly, that is not the best way to do it. Trying to review before you post is the best, but it's not always possible. I know that didn't fully answer your question, but that's
No, it was fine. And so flipping it to the other side, another question in the chat. By the way, thank you for your questions ahead of time. The Q&A box is open, so please add your questions as they come to you. There's over 100 people on the call. I'd be surprised if no one has a question. So my question here, Jordan, is flipping it to the other side. There's a question that came in. How can ODFIs assure their originators are following this rule? And so it's not really just the bank itself, but the bank's customer who's accepting that payment instruction or initiating that payment instruction. So what in the risk rule, what obligations are put on directly on originators? And then how does an ODFI express that rule, express that requirement to an originator?
so that's a huge challenge, right? And this is somewhat unique in the fact that when ACH started out, everything, all the warranties, everything was written towards the ODFI. And we are moving towards defining new roles and responsibilities for different parties. So we're putting new roles and responsibilities here on the RDFI. We're now including direct rules that impact the originator. And the ODFIs are stating, I warrant that my originators are following the rules. So it's up to the ODFIs to educate and ensure that they're doing what they need to do to identify fraud, that they've got controls in place, that we don't have just some open system where we're allowing originators to send ACH transactions into my financial institution, which then goes out to the network, right? That if you have a municipality, they're often targets for vendor impersonation fraud, right? That those municipalities have dual controls on, that they have uh, callback procedures to make sure that somebody doesn't just call in and say, "Hey, this is Jordan Bennett from Dave's Plumbing. Go ahead and we've got a huge contract coming up. This is my routing and account number. Just send all the payments there once I send you an invoice." Right? That's municipalities shouldn't just accept that. Um, there should be processes and procedures in place to help identify fraud before it actually hits the system. Some of these false pretenses, um, different scams, and so ODFIs, you work with those originators, help educate them, and verify that they've got good controls in place.
Yeah, and Wade, this is the kind of thing where certainly the ACH is a batch type network, but as an ODFI, as an originator, you see those requests come in real time.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying earlier too, right? And I think the bottom line is the bank always owns the risk, right? That's kind of bottom line up front for the FI. Um, and what we try to do as a partner is make it easier for the banks to see what's happening in real time and explain it, not explain it away necessarily, right? Um, I'm thinking about this too in the corporate context, right? Of corporate banking, how do we help identify what those policies are and how to help the banks mitigate the most amount of risk possible? So while the bank has a duty to work with those, let's say TPS or those originators, we also want to put the bank in the best position that we've got some fail safes, right? Some policies and whatnot that help things not fall through the cracks. And if something does fall through the crack, we should be reviewing, and we do with our customers, review what that looks like. What those fraud detection rates, capture rates, et cetera. Where are those things falling through the cracks?
Yeah, there's a corporate bank question in here. I'm going to read the question because I want to argue with a premise of the question. But the question says, what are corporate banks doing when they've been alerted to credits to their customer accounts? And then there's a parenthetical that says, knowing that we don't typically have money mules, as is the case with retail and consumer transactions. That's the part I want to argue with. I think that bad guys have as many corporate accounts as they have consumer accounts. But in any case, what do you see different on the corporate side and the consumer side in terms of how we react? What signals do we look for? How do we react when we see those signals? Wait.
Yeah, those signal. I mean, it definitely looks very different on the corporate side. Thinking about, I work with a fairly large bank out of the Midwest, and we're going through some of these changes right now for them. And the challenge here is understanding how those patterns look different than retail. Retail tends to get a lot of focus because it's noisy, and what we see is banks in the past have kind of pushed business email compromise off the liability of the FI to deal with, and because it's not within the bank's purview of having that, like it's not within their system, right? And with this kind of rule change, which I think is good, is because business email compromise is lumped in here with this false pretense, we're putting some onus on the banks to say you can't just write it off because it didn't happen in your ecosystem. And that's not what they're doing, right? But that's the sense that the corporate banking infrastructure gives everyone.
Yeah, Jordan, any thoughts on that? Not to put you on the spot.
Sure. No, I tend to agree. And it's usually not I would say that I would argue that the bank usually isn't left holding the bag, right? So your originator, if it's a municipality that has succumbed to vendor impersonation fraud, they're going to have to be the ones that are working through their insurance, or if they don't have insurance, trying to get that money back. And often once it's gone, it's gone, right? This is multi-channel, like you were alluding to earlier, Wade. An ACH transaction may go into an account that is either at a money mule or the fraudster, and then they're going to turn around and send it out on another channel. And, I would like everybody to, when they're thinking about these credit push fraud schemes and how they're all done, don't just think of this as an ACH problem or a instant payment problem or a wire problem. A lot of the stuff that you're, putting into place for ACH can be expanded out onto these other platforms, because you don't want them to, you wouldn't want them to commit fraud on a different platform either, just because they're not using ACH. Don't let the fraudsters use instant payments, right? So many of the lessons you learn here can be then used over there on different platforms. Think of it holistically, right?
Yeah, and that directly addresses one of the other questions that's in here about how this rule and the ACH network coexists with other with RTP, FedNow, other rails. But the bottom line is the bad guys love confusion. They love the idea that they can move between rails. And I think, this rule is an indication that Nacha wants the ACH network to kind of come up to that level of we don't want to be the weak link in the chain.
Not at all. Not at all.
So there's another question in here about intended rule enforcement. So is Nacha walking around with a billy club, kind of knocking on doors of banks, or what's going to happen? What's going to happen on April 1st if somebody does nothing?
So we have a different rule enforcement mechanism. This one is going to be enforced like many of our other rules, where you're going to have to do an audit. This should be part of your audit. And if you're a financial institution, many of your regulators are going to be reviewing that audit as well. Now, they are not a support arm for Notch or anything like that, but that is something that they do in their course of business, is look at your looking at your audits. And they're not going to cite you for specific rules, but not following the rules is something that we've heard them say is an unsound or unsafe banking practice. So it is important that you're following the Notch rules, because you have other entities looking at your audits. You want to make sure that you're following your audits just to be in compliance with the rules. You state it in your warranties that you are compliant with the rules and following the Notch rules. But yeah, we're not going out immediately, and there's not a mechanism in place where we can go out and immediately ask. And
I guess in the list of things that Wade was talking about that need to be done, kind of the last box in that should have been make sure that you're prepared for and execute an audit.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. I often think of that as just something that's known, but we do find that especially with originator or with third-party senders, many of them don't know that they need audits. Banks should be giving that message. It is much less common than it used to be that third-party senders didn't know they needed an audit. But if you're a third-party sender, if you're an ODFI, you are required to go through a rules compliance audit every single year, and this should be part of it.
Yep. Any further thoughts on that, Wade?
I was actually thinking about this from the RDFI side as well, and I wanted to shift maybe a little bit towards that because we haven't talked about that yet.
Shift away.
Yeah. I mean, Jordan, from the perspective of every FI, that's a new requirement, right? Having any kind of RDFI focused rule to this effect, especially around anything to do with scams. So from your perspective, I can see that Nacha isn't asking banks to stop all fraud, but you're asking for them to be able to prove that they understand their risk and making intentional decisions and all of that. Um, from your perspective, what's the thing that RDFIs need to be most watchful of?
So I think putting in their documented processes and procedures and making sure that you're following those. That's going to be in the audit. And the rules compliance audit is not just an ODFI requirement. It's for the RDFIs too. So it has always been any FI needs a rules compliance audit, even if you're RDFI only. So that's not really a change. But this is, of course, a big change for RDFIs, that they're having to do this monitoring and trying to identify as fraud comes in, as that fraudster is there. I don't think it is hugely different from some of the BSA AML requirements that banks have been doing for a very long time. And so if you're using some of those BSA AML techniques and tools, talk to your different departments. I went to a conference in November that was focused on BSA AML folks, not ACH operations folks. And we were talking about this exact topic. And at the end, we asked them how many were familiar with this upcoming rule change and whether they'd be willing to help out their operations folks. And very few people in the room were aware of the rule change, but almost all of them stated, yeah, we'd be happy to talk to our operations folks and see if, we can't share lessons learned, we can't share tools. There are certain things that BSA AML folks are not allowed to do. They cannot tell you when they're going to file a SAR. They can't, there are some things like that, but talk to your lawyers. There's a lot of stuff that they can talk about, that they can help you with. So communication within your financial institution or within your organization is absolutely key. I know I used to work at the Federal Reserve, and even somewhat here at Nacha, we can be siloed. And breaking down silos is extremely important. Communication across departments will save a lot of time, effort, and money.
I just want to hit
Yeah.
the preach button on
Yeah.
that one,
Preach, baby.
Jordan.
Yeah. Can I have
There,
an amen?
yeah, what we see is that's a critical piece, right? Your kind of all cause fraud teams, digital fraud, branch fraud, teller fraud, et cetera, first party fraud, and then BSA AML teams. If we can get them talking to each other,
Mhm.
the FI is a lot stronger.
Yeah. I'm
Absolutely.
going to take one of the other questions and turn it in a little bit of a direction. The question in here is, are there any Nacha rules? Is there any Nacha rules help on data science? I think I know the answer to that, but I'll turn it over to you in a second, Jordan. But
Go ahead.
importantly, just the stating of the question recognizes that this is a data problem. I have data that I need to collect. I have patterns that I need to look for. And so Jordan, weigh in on the rules stuff, and then Wade, talk about ways that what data might you now look for that you weren't looking for before. Jordan?
So there are no rules around data science, right? And we are, as I mentioned earlier, very non-specific on how you need to solve this problem. We, of course, talk to all the banks about what they're doing, and we've talked to folks that are really into the data science at JP Morgan Chase, and they're doing some cool stuff with data science. You can solve this problem however you like, right? It does not have to be one solution fits everybody. And but I think looking into the data is extremely important, and data science is one very good answer to this problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean that is what we do. We are a data science first company. So from our approach just at Outseer in general, and a lot of vendors in the space have a varied version of this, but we have a risk engine and a policy engine and pieces in place. I actually don't think, Peter, to your question, and then I'll go back a little bit. We don't have anything new that we're looking at. What we're looking at now is how do we codify what we're seeing. We're already looking at those risk factors, payment velocity, payee velocity and volume, amounts, device behavior, transaction behavior, et cetera. We're looking at those things already. Maybe it's just about pushing the program towards the other end of it. We talk about monitoring and reporting. So, are we marking those cases correctly? Are we tagging them correctly? Are we following up on those? Um, you know, so whether our customers are doing some of that themselves or using our fraud advisory services to help supplement that, to do the data science work, because that's something we definitely have to offer. Um, we're working with our customers kind of across the spectrum on that.
Yeah. So it's really, the good news is we have the tools. It's more about bringing the ACH network and ACH payments under the tent.
And
Cool.
intentionality, right? I keep saying it, intentionality. The program needs to have some intent behind it, and we need to be actually doing something about it on a consistent basis. I love that Nacha put in an annual audit requirement, like an annual update and review requirement for their program. But we do this with our customers on a biweekly or monthly basis where we're looking at policies. And again, not just for ACH, right? But it's part of an ecosystem of payments and digital interactions and physical interactions and all of that.
Yeah. And Jordan, a question for you on that annual audit, because as Reed mentioned, this is the kind of thing that you don't have to wait for annual. You could do it quarterly, you could do it more quickly, and you could do it across payment types, right? You could do it across instant, ACH, et cetera. And
Yeah.
is it enough for the Nacha rule that I say, yes, I have an annual fraud review or a quarterly fraud review, and this is where I include ACH?
So you don't have to have a standalone ACH audit. You can have a holistic audit that is, but your ACH, the
Needs to
components
be
of the
included.
ACH audit have to be included. We do a lot with third-party senders, and I talk a lot to that group, and they say, "Well, I have a PCI compliance PCI audit. Does it have to be different?" And PCI is very structured, right? And you have to do certain things. If you have a holistic audit that includes PCI components, ACH components, same or instant payment components, I think that works even better, because you should not have a separate policy for how I'm going to handle fraud in this one payment rail, but maybe I'll be a little bit looser over here, right? We want to stop all fraud. And dual controls, it doesn't matter what system you want to have dual controls if that's what you're using. You want to put these same tools in place, the anomaly detection, whatever vendor software that you're using, any of this data science, whatever tool it's in, user or the data that it's looking at, the payment rails, it should all be working very similarly across multiple channels. So having a holistic look is ideal.
Yeah. So I'll address one more question here, and then we'll wrap it up. Come back to you guys for final thoughts. But there's two different questions in here that talk about what the rule might change with regard to returns, returns thresholds, timing, etc. So talk about a little bit about what happens when I see one of these transactions that I think might be running afoul, and what are my protections then if I go ahead and return it? Like, is somebody going to come back and say, no, 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 it was good, you shouldn't have done that? Jordan?
Sure. Yeah. So with returns, nothing has changed as far as timing. When you have to review the rules, we did put in a extended, we matched Reg CC with how long it takes to post. So we can't go beyond Reg CC. We can only adjust the Nacha rules. So you have to make that decision, in what's still a fairly short amount of time. You can't hold it for weeks or whatever while you try and figure it out. And then if you do decide to return it, you've always been able to return a transaction for any reason on the ACH network. If you think that it is fraudulent, you've got to that's your best choice, right? Is to return that. You don't want to pay out a fraudster. You may have some reputational risk, right? If it is a good transaction and you return it, that is going to cause some heartache, but it's up to the banks to really figure this out. I had a really interesting call. I was a few months ago about R17. I had a small bank call in, and they had a customer who had claimed to win. It was like $1 million through online sports betting in the UK, which is a thing that happens, right? But I'm sure all the bankers have looked at their accounts, and they can see that this account holder has funded sports betting accounts. They have had transactions in, transactions out. There's records of somebody in a pattern who fits this, right? You don't just all of a sudden get $1 million into your account and say, "Oh, I've been sports betting forever," which is what happened here. And the banker said, I see no patterns of any previous activity. And I said, I can't tell you if this is fraud or not, only you can determine that. And she decided to return that R17 because there was, there was no evidence that they had ever engaged in this type of prior activity. So they returned it, and the customer was super angry, right? But the customer was probably also committing fraud. I don't know how it ended, but that's what it sounded like to me. And as a bank, you're going to have to make those decisions. You may make somebody angry, and if that was a legitimate payout, they'll be able to get it some way or the other. But you really don't want to give $1 million to a fraudster.
Yeah.
Probably
All
not.
right. Well, great. So we're going to wrap up here. First of all, thank you all, everyone online for joining. On behalf of Outseer, we want to thank you, Nacha. Thank you very much for joining. Over on the right-hand side, there's a resources tab. If you click on the resources, there's a white paper to download. Jordan, in his slide, had a link to resources available on the Nacha website, so feel free to go there. In wrapping up, we're going to go to Wade first, then Jordan. Final thoughts, like if people walked away from this with only one thing, what would you want that one thing to be? Wade.
Yeah. If any of this feels uncomfortable, I think that's kind of the point, right? Fraud risk doesn't really fit neatly into a checklist, and Nacha isn't asking banks to be perfect. They're asking people to be intentional, consistent, and be able to explain their decisions. And so, something we can do if you're still uncomfortable with that conversation, happy to continue that conversation on our end. But if you can execute on this, the rule doesn't just help with ACH; it makes your entire fraud program stronger, and that's what we're here to help with.
All right. Thank you. Jordan, you get the last word, buddy.
Yeah, I'd say build your program, make sure that it's compliant, and don't leave it there. Make it always improve. So you can always get better. You can learn from what you've done, learn from what you've documented, do some tweaks, do some testing, and improve it. The goal here is not just to put in a compliance program. It really is to stop the bad guys. We want to get fraud off the ACH network and off of your financial institution. We don't want you to be victimized or anybody else.
Yep, we all have a common goal of we want payments to be safe. Once again, thank you all very much for joining me. Peter Tapling, Jordan Bennett, Wade Raef. Until next time.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Wade.
Cheers.